Sophia Williams had never felt so out of place. As she entered the sleek glass building of Brooks West Consulting, the overwhelming smell of polished wood and expensive cologne only heightened her sense of discomfort. The lobby was filled with people dressed in tailored suits, their voices low and confident as they discussed the latest projects. She was just another recent graduate, eager to make her mark, but the walls around her felt like they were closing in. Despite her impressive resume, there was something about this place that made her feel like an outsider. Her new manager, Ethan Brooks, had made it clear from their very first meeting that he wasn't interested in making friends. His eyes, cool and calculating, swept over her without a second glance, and his terse instructions had left her wondering if she had even earned her spot at the firm. He was a man who thrived on control, a senior partner with a reputation for being aloof and detached. Every interaction she had with him was a battle of wills. Him, always distant and professional. Her, trying to navigate the suffocating atmosphere with a sense of dignity. The tension between them was palpable. He barely spoke unless necessary, and when he did, his words felt like ice, sharp and deliberate. Sophia had quickly learned to keep her head down, focusing on the work that piled up on her desk. But it was hard not to wonder, why had she been chosen for this position? Was she just another pawn in a game of office politics? But then something changed. Slowly at first, like a flicker of light breaking through a dense fog. Sophia was assigned to work directly under Ethan on a high-profile project. At first, it was business as usual. Ethan would dictate, and Sophia would follow. She'd find herself sitting in his office late into the evening, analyzing reports and brainstorming strategies. But it wasn't the work that caught her attention. It was Ethan. There was something about the way he spoke, his eyes piercing through the thick fog of office chatter, that pulled her in. He was intense, calculating, but there was a sharpness to his mind that intrigued her. For the first time since she joined the firm, she felt a flicker of excitement. Something beyond the suffocating fear of failure. Yet, she was also terrified of how close she was becoming to the very man who had made her feel invisible just weeks ago. One evening, as they stayed late to finalize the project details, Sophia caught a glimpse of Ethan outside his professional armor. The cold facade he wore so well cracked, if only for a moment, as he opened up about his past. They were sitting in the dimly lit conference room, papers scattered between them. It was supposed to be just another work session, but Ethan began speaking in a way that surprised Sophia. His usual stern demeanor faded as he revealed the source of his emotional walls. A past relationship that had left scars deeper than anyone could see. His eyes softened as he spoke of the woman he had loved and lost, and Sophia couldn't help but feel an unexpected surge of empathy. Here was the man she had been trying so hard to understand, now vulnerable in a way she had never seen. Ethan wasn't the unfeeling robot she had assumed him to be. Beneath the cool exterior was a man who had been deeply hurt, someone who had learned to guard his heart with walls so high no one could get close. Sophia, in that moment, saw a side of him that no one else did. He wasn't just the ruthless senior partner. He was someone who had loved and lost, someone who was still picking up the pieces. The revelation hit her harder than she expected. There was an undeniable connection between them now, something that went beyond their professional roles. And as they worked together more, the boundaries between their professional relationship and something much deeper began to blur. Their interactions, once strictly business, started to feel charged with an undercurrent of tension, of something unspoken, something dangerous. Sophia tried to ignore the growing pull she felt toward him, but it was getting harder to resist. Ethan's moments of vulnerability, so rare and fleeting, were etched in her mind. She caught herself thinking about him even when they weren't working together, wondering what he was doing, what he was thinking. And then there were those moments, when their hands brushed, when their eyes lingered just a moment too long, when she realized that, Despite her best efforts, she was falling for him. But would he ever let her in? Would he ever allow her to get close enough to see the man he really was? Or would she always be just another fleeting moment in his carefully controlled life? As she stood in front of his office the next morning, the usual knot of anxiety in her stomach twisted tighter. She had been trying to keep her feelings in check, but after their late-night conversation, it was becoming harder to deny the attraction that simmered just below the surface. Sophia wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Her life at Brooks West Consulting was never going to be the same, and neither would her relationship with Ethan Brooks. The office had been quiet for hours, with only the hum of air conditioning and the rustling of papers breaking the silence. Sophia sat at her desk, glancing up at the clock. It was already past 8, but she wasn't ready to leave. The latest project was demanding, and she knew she couldn't afford to let any detail slip through the cracks. But as she looked over the reports again, her mind kept drifting back to Ethan. She had learned to focus on the work, keeping her personal feelings locked away. But there was something about the way Ethan had opened to her that night. It had left a mark. For the first time, she saw him as more than just the distant senior partner. He was human. And in that moment, Sophia realized she couldn't deny the growing pull between them any longer. She tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept creeping back, wrapping around her like a tightrope she couldn't escape. The way he looked at her when they worked together, those quiet moments when their hands brushed or their eyes met, it all felt like an unspoken promise. Yet, every time she found herself thinking about him, doubt crept in. Could she really trust him? Could she let herself be vulnerable with a man who had built such high walls around his heart? Sophia wasn't sure if she was ready for what that might mean. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to see Ethan walking toward her, a stack of papers in his hands. As he reached her desk, he paused and gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Still working?" he asked, his voice low, almost too casual. Sophia nodded, offering him a strained smile in return. "Yeah, just making sure everything's in order," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. For a moment, the silence hung between them like a weight. Ethan placed the papers down on her desk, his hand brushing lightly against hers as he did. The touch was brief, but it sent a spark through her. She caught her breath and looked up at him, but he was already looking away, his expression unreadable. Was it just her imagination, or was there something more in the way he avoided her gaze? She couldn't tell, but it was beginning to drive her crazy. "Ethan," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned his head at the sound of her voice, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that evening. There it was again. The tension in the air, thick and undeniable. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know why she asked. It wasn't like her to get personal at work, but something about the way he was acting made her wonder if there was something more he wasn't saying. Ethan hesitated before answering, a flicker of something crossing his face. For a moment, he almost looked vulnerable. "Yeah, just tired," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's been a long day." Sophia nodded, but she wasn't sure if she believed him. There was more to it, she could feel it. The way he had spoken to her that night, the way he had let his guard slip, made her wonder if there was something more buried beneath his cool exterior. But she knew better than to push him too hard. Ethan didn't like to talk about his feelings. She had learned that much in the weeks they had worked together. But somehow, she couldn't help herself. She needed to know. Before she could speak again, Ethan's phone buzzed, interrupting the moment. He glanced at it, then back at her, his expression returning to its usual guarded state. "I have to take this," he said, his voice suddenly curt. Sophia watched as he turned away and answered the call, his tone changing immediately. She knew that she shouldn't feel disappointed, but she couldn't help it. every time they got close. Every time they got close, every time they had a moment like this, it always felt like something came between them. She turned back to her work, trying to focus, but her thoughts kept returning to Ethan. She found herself thinking about him more and more, how his eyes would soften when he talked about things that mattered to him, the way he always seemed to be in control, yet had a hint of sadness in his eyes, a sadness that she couldn't quite understand. It wasn't long before Ethan finished his call and stood up, gathering his things. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, his voice professional once more. "Get some rest." Sophia nodded, watching him walk away. As the door to his office closed behind him, she let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. She couldn't deny it anymore. She was falling for him, but she wasn't sure if he felt the same way, or if he ever would. As the night wore on, Sophia continued to work, but her mind kept drifting back to the same question. What if Ethan was finally letting his walls down? What if, just maybe, he was feeling the same way? She couldn't be sure, but one thing was certain. This tangled web of emotions between them wasn't something either of them could walk away from. Not anymore. Sophia's heart was racing as she sat in her car, staring at the towering glass building before her. It was a beautiful evening, the city lights casting a warm glow on the streets below, but all she could think about was Ethan. After weeks of confusion, desire, and hesitation, she was about to face him again. And this time, everything felt different. The tension between them had reached its peak, and there was no escaping it anymore. She had tried to ignore the attraction, tried to keep things professional, but every passing day had made it harder to do so. And now, here she was, sitting in her car, unsure if she was ready to confront the emotions she had buried deep within herself. The door to the office opened, and Sophia caught a glimpse of Ethan walking towards her. His stride was confident, but there was something in his expression that made her stomach flip. It was a mixture of determination and something softer, something that made her wonder if he had finally let down his guard. She had seen flashes of that vulnerability before, those rare moments when his icy demeanor cracked, revealing a man who had been hurt, who had buried his feelings to protect himself. And for some reason, those glimpses of his true self had made her heart ache. As he reached her, he didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning her face as if he was trying to read her thoughts. Sophia felt the weight of his gaze, and for a split second, she almost forgot how to breathe. There was an undeniable pull between them, something magnetic, something they couldn't ignore, no matter how hard they tried. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, her hands nervously clasped in front of her. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I wasn't expecting you to stay late tonight," he said, his voice low with a touch of amusement that didn't quite mask the uncertainty in his eyes. Sophia swallowed hard. "I didn't think you would notice," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Ethan's lips quirked into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I always notice, Sophia." There it was again, the way he said her name, the way his voice seemed to linger on it, like it held more weight than just a simple word. It made her heart skip a beat. She looked up at him, trying to steady her breath, trying to keep herself composed. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice faltering slightly, "about everything. About us." His expression shifted, the guarded mask he often wore slipping into place. "There's no us, Sophia," he said, his tone firm, though she could still hear the underlying vulnerability in his voice. "You're just a colleague to me, a good one. But nothing more." Sophia's chest tightened at his words. It stung more than she cared to admit, but she had to stay strong. She couldn't let him keep pushing her away, not when she had come so far, Not when she knew that there was something real between them, something that neither of them could deny anymore. "Don't lie to me, Ethan," she said, her voice growing more confident. "I know there's more between us. I felt it, and I know you felt it too. We can't keep pretending it's not there." Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if he was weighing whether or not to let his walls crumble. He took a step closer to her, his presence overwhelming. "Sophia, you don't know what you're asking for," he said quietly. "I've been hurt before. I'm not someone who can just open up to people. It's easier to keep things professional, to keep you at a distance." Sophia felt a wave of empathy wash over her. She could see the pain in his eyes, the hesitation in his every word. He had been scarred by love, just like she had. Maybe that's why they were both so hesitant to take the leap, to risk everything for something that could break them. But Sophia wasn't willing to let fear control her anymore. She had spent too long running from her feelings, and she couldn't keep doing it. "I don't need you to be perfect," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I just need you to be real with me. I'm not asking you to open up all at once, but I need to know that you're not shutting me out. Because if you are, then we're not even going to have a chance." Ethan's gaze softened, and for a moment, Sophia thought he might finally say what they both needed to hear. But instead, he closed his eyes for a brief second, as if trying to collect himself. When he opened them again, the cold, distant expression's back, but this time, it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't know what you're getting into, Sophia," he said, his voice low, almost regretful. "I'm not like other men. I don't fall in love easily, and I don't know if I can give you what you want." Sophia felt a pang of disappointment, but she refused to back down. "I'm not asking for perfection, Ethan. I just want a chance to see where this could go, a chance for us to figure it out together." There was a long pause, and then, for the first time in weeks, Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He didn't say anything. Instead, he simply placed his hand on her cheek, his touch gentle, almost hesitant. It was as if he was afraid that if he touched her too much, everything would shatter. But the moment their skin made contact, something inside Sophia shifted. It was as if the universe had finally given them permission to be together, to let down their guard and take a risk. "I can't promise you anything," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I'll try. For you." Sophia's heart soared as she reached up, her hand resting over his. "That's all I'm asking for." And in that moment, as their gazes locked and the world around them seemed to fade away, Sophia knew that this was just the beginning. The days that followed the kiss were a blur of emotion for Sophia. She couldn't deny the thrill of it, the way her heart had raced when Ethan's lips had claimed hers. It was unexpected, yet inevitable. Every moment that had led up to that kiss, those stolen glances, the quiet words shared in the office, the tension that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface, had all converged into one electrifying moment. But now, as she sat in her apartment that evening, staring at her phone, she realized that it wasn't just the kiss that had left her breathless. It was the uncertainty that lingered afterward. Ethan had pulled away too quickly, too suddenly, as if he feared the very thing that had drawn them together. The words he had spoken, his insistence that things between them couldn't be more than professional, replayed in her mind like an echo, taunting her. She had known it wouldn't be easy with him. She had known that the walls he had so carefully built around himself would take time to break down. But what hurt the most was the way he had dismissed it all, as if their connection was something he could control, something he could shut off with a simple declaration. Sophia ran her fingers through her hair and sighed. She hated how much she cared. She hated how, despite everything, she couldn't just let go of the pull she felt toward him. Ethan was unlike anyone she had ever met. He was guarded, sure, but there was something beneath that exterior, a depth she hadn't yet fully understood. She could feel it every time they spoke, every time he let his guard down, just a little, and that was what made her want to fight for him. But how could she fight for someone who didn't seem to want to fight for her? The phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Ethan. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, already knowing it would be short and to the point. But when she read the message, her stomach dropped. "Sophia, I think we need to talk. I know I've been distant, but I don't want things to be like this between us. Can we meet tomorrow?" Her heart skipped a beat. The words were brief, yet the underlying tone was enough to make her feel something shift. Ethan was reaching out. He was trying in his own way. She quickly typed a response. "Of course, I'll meet you tomorrow." The next day, as she stood in front of the coffee shop where they had agreed to meet, Sophia's nerves were on edge. She had no idea what to expect. Would Ethan finally open up about everything? Would he admit the truth? That he felt what she felt but was too scared to act on it? Or would he shut her out again, just like he had before? As she waited, she tried to calm her racing thoughts, but every minute felt like an eternity. She wondered if Ethan was going to tell her he couldn't do this, that he couldn't let himself fall for her, that he couldn't let himself fall for her, that he wasn't capable of being what she needed. It would hurt, but at least she would have clarity. And clarity, in a way, was better than the confusion she had been drowning in. When Ethan finally arrived, his expression was as unreadable as ever. But there was something different about him today, something softer in his eyes, something that made Sophia's heart beat faster. He walked over to the table and sat down across from her, his posture stiff but not defensive. He didn't speak right away, as if he was gathering his thoughts. Sophia's gaze stayed on him, waiting, hoping that this time would be different. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking about everything. About us. And I know I've been distant. I know I've pushed you away. But I've realized that I can't keep doing that. I can't keep pretending that I don't care, because I do, Sophia. I care about you more than I should, and it scares the hell out of me." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The vulnerability in his words hit her like a tidal wave. It was the first time she had heard him admit what she had known all along, that he was afraid. But the fact that he was willing to admit it, to face it, meant something. It meant that there was hope for them. Maybe not everything was lost after all. "I don't want to hurt you," Ethan continued, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't know how to do this, how to open up, how to let someone in, but I want to try. For you. For us." Eyes softening as she looked at him. "I don't need you to be perfect, Ethan. I don't need you to have all the answers. I just need you to be honest with me. I just need you to be honest with me. I need to know that you're willing to take the risk too, because I'm willing to take it." There was a long silence between them, a tension that hung in the air. And then Ethan reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly as it brushed against hers. Sophia felt the electric spark of his touch, and in that moment she knew that this was the beginning of something real, something that neither of them could run from anymore. "I'm scared too," Ethan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to take that risk with you. Let's see where this goes." And just like that, everything shifted. The walls that had kept them apart began to crumble. And for the first time, Sophia felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. There was no guarantee of what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she was ready to face it with Ethan by her side. Sophia walked into the office the next morning, her mind spinning from the conversation she and Ethan had shared the night before. The words he had said were still fresh in her mind. "I care about you more than I should, and it scares the hell out of me." It was a confession she hadn't expected, but it was exactly what she needed to hear. He was finally opening up, finally acknowledging the unspoken bond that had been building between them for weeks. But now, as she sat at her desk, that overwhelming sense of uncertainty returned. What did it all mean? Were they really ready to navigate the complexities of a relationship? Or was it just a fleeting moment of vulnerability? The office felt different today. Charged, electric. Sophia could almost feel Ethan's presence in the air, even though he hadn't entered yet. She kept her gaze down, focusing on her work, but her mind wandered. Every time she thought of Ethan, her heart beat faster. The uncertainty of their situation made it all the more intense. She couldn't help but wonder what was next. Would he stay true to his word and pursue something with her, or would the weight of his fears cause him to retreat once more? The clock on the wall ticked loudly in her ears, as if mocking her restless thoughts. She glanced up and found Ethan walking toward her, a folder in his hand. He looked the same, composed, professional, but there was something about him today that was different. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual, and Sophia felt her stomach flutter. He had always been distant, always kept her at arm's length. But now, there was an openness in his eyes. She couldn't help but wonder if he was still processing everything they had shared, still trying to understand what it meant for both of them. "Morning," Ethan said, his voice calm but with a hint of something softer. He placed the folder on her desk, his hand brushing against hers briefly. The simple touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, reminding her just how much she wanted this, how much she wanted him. "Morning," she replied, her voice steadied despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with tension, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of tension that buzzed with possibility. It was the kind of tension that buzzed with possibility. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than usual. "I've been thinking about what we talked about last night," he said, his eyes searching hers. "About taking risks, about trying to make this work." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. He was still willing to try. She had been afraid he would pull away, that his fear would win out over his desire for her. But here he was, still standing before her, still willing to take a step forward. "Do you think we can make it work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her nerves were back in full force, but she pushed them aside. If they were going to do this, they needed to be honest. They needed to be honest. They needed to be honest. They needed to face whatever came next together. Ethan hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I don't know," he said, his voice raw with honesty, "but I'm willing to find out. I don't want to live in fear anymore, Sophia. I don't want to keep shutting you out when all I've ever wanted is to be close to you." His words were like a balm to her soul. It was everything she had hoped he would say, everything she had needed to hear. The man she had seen as cold and unapproachable was now opening up, allowing himself to be vulnerable with her. And in that moment, Sophia realized that she had been right all along. This connection, this pull between them, was something real. "I want to take that risk with you," she said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "I don't know where this will lead, but I'm willing to try. I've never felt like this before, Ethan. And I don't want to let it slip away." A small, tentative smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's lips, his eyes softening as he looked at her. For the first time, he seemed at peace, as if the walls he had built around himself were finally coming down. "Then let's do it," he said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "Let's figure this out together. No more running, no more hiding." And with that, everything shifted. The uncertainty that had loomed over them for so long seemed to fade away, replaced by a new sense of hope, a new sense of possibility. It wouldn't be easy. They both knew that. But for the first time, Sophia felt that the weight of their fears had been lifted, if only for a moment. As the day wore on, Sophia couldn't stop smiling. Every time she caught a glimpse of Ethan across the room, her heart fluttered. There was still so much to navigate, so much they had to figure out, but she knew one thing for sure. They were in this together, and that was all that mattered. Sophia couldn't stop replaying the words in her mind as she sat at her desk the next morning. Let's do it. Let's figure this out together. Ethan's voice had been filled with a quiet determination, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. They were no longer just dancing around the truth. They were finally confronting it together, but as the excitement of their decision began to settle, a new reality emerged, one where they had to face the difficult, often painful process of actually making it work. As the days passed, their interactions began to shift. There was no more pretending. Every glance, every touch was laced with something deeper, something more intense than either of them had anticipated. In the beginning, it felt like a delicate balance. How much was too much? How much could they share without completely losing themselves? And yet, with every step forward, they seemed to understand each other more. The moments of silence between them didn't feel awkward anymore. They were comfortable, even peaceful. But there were still moments, small moments, that made Sophia's heart race with doubt. Ethan's walls weren't gone. They were simply lowered. And every now and then, they would rise again, blocking her out just when she thought she had reached him. That evening, as they sat together at a small cafe after work, Sophia couldn't ignore the tension that had slowly built up between them. Ethan had been quieter than usual, his gaze distant as he absently stirred his coffee. Sophia tried not to let it bother her, but it was hard not to notice the change. The promise he had made to her felt fragile in that moment, as if it was teetering on the edge of something they couldn't quite control. She knew he was trying. She knew he was scared, but the truth was, she's scared too. She had given him a piece of her heart, and now, she didn't know if he would return it or crush it. "Hey," she said softly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. His eyes snapped up to hers, and for a moment, she saw something flicker in them. Something that looked like guilt or regret. She wasn't sure. The way he pulled his hand away made her stomach drop. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a question that had been weighing on her for days. She knew something was wrong, even if he hadn't said it aloud. Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, everything's fine," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. It wasn't like him to lie, at least, not like this. Sophia could see the struggle in his eyes. He wasn't fine, and neither was she. "Then why do you look like that?" Sophia asked, her own frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why do I feel like we're standing on the edge of something, waiting for it to fall apart?" Ethan sighed and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet but tinged with something raw. "I'm trying, Sophia, I really am, but sometimes it just feels like I'm not enough for you. Like I'm not enough for you. Like I'm not enough to make this work." Sophia's heart tightened at his words. She wanted to reach out, to reassure him that she wasn't going anywhere, but the doubt in his voice made her hesitate. She understood his fears. They mirrored her own. They were both fighting against a past that threatened to define their present. She had been hurt before, and so had he. But they couldn't keep letting their pasts dictate their future. "You don't have to be perfect," she said, her voice firm. "I don't need you to have everything figured out. We don't need to have it all figured out, Ethan. All I need is for you to keep trying. That's all I'm asking for." His eyes softened as he looked at her. the hardness in his gaze slowly fading. "But what if it's not enough?" he whispered, almost to himself. Sophia reached out, her fingers brushing his once more. This time, he didn't pull away. "It will be enough. As long as we're both in this, it will be enough." She could feel the weight of his fears, but she wasn't about to let them control their relationship. They were standing at the edge of something new, something beautiful, and she refused to let fear push them back into the shadows. Ethan studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense but searching, as if he was trying to read her, to understand if she really meant it. Finally, he nodded. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly, "but I want to learn. With you." Sophia smiled, her heart swelling with relief. "Then we'll figure it out." And for the first time since they had taken that leap, Sophia felt like they had truly begun. The journey ahead would not be easy, but they had each other. And that was more than enough. Sophia's heart was pounding as she walked into the office the following morning. After the conversation with Ethan the night before, she had hoped things would be different between them. She thought that maybe they had finally found their footing, but as she passed by his office, she couldn't help but feel the shift in the air. Ethan had always been enigmatic, but now it felt as though there was an even deeper distance between them. His presence had been a comfort for so long, but now it felt like a weight she couldn't bear. They had made promises to each other, to try, to take risks. But those promises now felt fragile, hanging in the air like an unfinished thought. As the day wore on, Sophia tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting to Ethan. Every time they passed each other in the hall, their eyes would meet for a brief moment, but there was nothing in his gaze that reassured her. It wasn't like before, when there had been warmth and understanding, even when words were unspoken. Now, there was nothing but an emptiness that made her question everything they had built. Had they made a mistake by trying to make it work? Was it too soon for them to tackle the emotional weight of a relationship while still navigating their own personal fears and insecurities? Around noon, Sophia received a message from Ethan, asking her to meet him in his office. The butterflies in her stomach made it hard to breathe, as she quickly responded and made her way to him. She wasn't sure what to expect, whether it would be another one of those painful conversations where they acknowledged the gap between them, or if it was going to be something more. She had hoped for clarity, but now she wasn't so sure she was ready for the truth. When she arrived at his office, Ethan was sitting behind his desk, his usual calm exterior in place. But his eyes, the way they met hers, told a different story. There was a flicker of something. Concern, maybe. Regret. It was hard to tell, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. The door closed behind her, and the silence was deafening. Ethan motioned for her to sit, and she did, her heart in her throat. "Sophia, we need to talk," he began, his voice unusually soft, almost apologetic. His words sent a chill through her. She had feared this moment, knowing that everything between them was so delicate. He paused as if struggling to find the right words. Sophia nodded, unsure of where this conversation would go. "And?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan sighed, leaning forward, his hands clasped together. "I think I've been holding back more than I realized," he admitted. "I've told myself that I'm ready for this, ready for us. But the truth is, I'm not sure I am. I'm afraid, Sophia. I'm afraid that if I let myself fully open up to you, I'll just screw it all up. I've been hurt before, and I built these walls to protect myself, but now they're keeping me from being the person you deserve." The words hit her harder than she expected. Ethan, the man who had been so distant for so long, was now admitting that his fears were suffocating him. He wasn't rejecting her, but he was rejecting the idea of letting himself be vulnerable, letting himself trust again. And Sophia, in that moment, felt a wave of empathy for him. She understood what it was like to build walls, to keep people out, to hold on to pain, because it was easier than facing the uncertainty of opening up. "I get it, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "I've been afraid too, afraid of getting hurt, of giving everything and having it fall apart. But we can't keep living in fear. I don't want to. I want to take this step with you, even if it's hard, even if we don't have all the answers." Ethan's eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a crack in the armor he had so carefully built. "I want to believe that too," he said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "But I need you to know that I might not always get it right. I might pull away when things get tough, and I might say things that don't make sense, but I'm trying. I need you to be patient with me." Sophia reached out, placing her hand gently over his. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the way his hand trembled slightly, and in that moment, she knew they were both in this together, even if they didn't have all the answers yet. "I can be patient," she whispered. "I can be patient as long as you're willing to try too." There was a long pause, and then, for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan smiled. It wasn't a perfect smile, but it was enough. It was the kind of smile that spoke of a man who was willing to take a risk, even if it scared him. "I'm willing," he said, his voice steady and filled with resolve. "I don't want to run anymore." Sophia smiled back, her heart lighter than it had been in days. They didn't have all the answers, and their journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt a sense of hope. Together, they would figure it out. Together, they would face their fears and build something real. And that was enough. Sophia sat at her desk, her fingers brushing over the edges of the report in front of her, but her mind was elsewhere. After the conversation she and Ethan had had the night before, she thought they had turned a corner. For the first time, they had truly acknowledged the tension between them and the fears that had kept them apart. They were no longer dancing around the truth, pretending that things could just stay the same. The weight of their feelings, of their connection, was finally out in the open. But now, as the hours ticked by, that familiar uncertainty crept back into her chest, filling the space between her heartbeats. She couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much they had confessed, they were still standing at the edge of something dangerous. Ethan had been so open with her, but she couldn't help but wonder, could they really make it work? Could they push through their pasts, their insecurities, and build something that lasted? Or was this all just an emotional storm, a fleeting moment of vulnerability before the walls went back up? The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the caller ID and saw Ethan's name flash across the screen. Her heart skipped a beat. It had been a few hours since they last spoke, and yet his presence still lingered in every corner of her mind. She hesitated for a moment before answering, unsure of what kind of conversation this would lead to. "Hey, it's me," Ethan's voice came through the speaker, his tone warm but tinged with uncertainty. "Hey," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. "What's up?" There was a slight pause before Ethan spoke again, his words measured, like he was carefully choosing what to say. "I've been thinking about what we talked about yesterday, about making things work." Sophia's pulse quickened. She could sense that he was about to say something important, and Ethan sighed softly, and she could almost hear the weight of the hesitation in his breath. "I want to try, Sophia. I really do. But I need you to know that it's not going to be easy for me. I've spent so long building these walls, pushing people away, that now I don't even know how to break them down. I'm afraid that if I let you in completely, I'll disappoint you, or worse, hurt you." Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, the words hitting her like a wave. She knew he had his doubts. She could feel it in the way he hesitated to get too close, the way he sometimes pulled away when things felt too real. But hearing him voice those fears made it all the more real. They were both standing on shaky ground, unsure of whether to take the next step, unsure if the other would be there to catch them if they fell. She let out a slow breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I can't promise that everything will be perfect. I can't promise that I won't hurt you, or that we won't face challenges. But what I can promise is that I'm here. I'm willing to take that risk with you. And if we fall together. But if we don't try, we'll never know what could have been." There was silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Sophia wondered if she had said too much, if she had pushed too hard. But then, Ethan spoke, his voice softer than before. "I don't want to be afraid anymore, Sophia. I don't want to keep running from this. From you. You've been patient with me, and I owe it to both of us to give this a real chance." Sophia smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was the first time she felt like Ethan was letting go of his fears, even if only a little, and opening himself up to the possibility of something more. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice filled with affection. "And I believe in us." Another pause, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. Ethan chuckled softly, and Sophia could hear the tension begin to fade from his voice. "Yeah, me too. We'll figure this out, right?" "Together," Sophia replied, her heart light with hope. "Together," he echoed, and for the first time in a long while, she truly believed it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, they were both willing to walk it side by side, and that was all that mattered. Sophia paced the small apartment, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. After the conversation with Ethan earlier that evening, she felt more uncertain than ever. The promise they had made to take a leap together, to face their fears and the barriers they had built around themselves, was supposed to bring clarity, but now it only felt like more weight pressing down on her. She had never been afraid of commitment, but the emotional vulnerability she was being asked to embrace now seemed more daunting than anything she'd faced before. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a message from Ethan, and just seeing his name made her stomach flip. She had tried to steady herself, tried to silence the doubts in her head, but whenever Ethan reached out, everything seemed to spiral. She picked up the phone, hesitated, then opened his message. "I can't stop thinking about what you said earlier. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I want to give this a real chance. Can we meet tomorrow? I need to talk to you." Sophia felt a wave of relief, followed by a pang of nervousness. This wasn't just a casual check-in. There was something more behind his words, something that felt like a final attempt to define their future. He wasn't backing away. He was asking for clarity, just as she had, and that terrified her. The truth was, she had been holding on to hope for too long. Hope that things could somehow fall into place, that their feelings would be enough to overcome the mess of their pasts. But deep down, she knew better. She couldn't keep running from the reality of their situation. If they were going to move forward, they needed to confront everything. Together. The next morning, she arrived at the cafe early, her hands trembling as she adjusted her coat and glanced around for Ethan. Her thoughts were clouded with anticipation and fear, but she knew they couldn't keep going in circles. She wanted answers, even if they weren't the ones she had hoped for. Ethan was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee in front of him. When he saw her approach, his eyes softened, but there was something else in them. A mix of determination and vulnerability that mirrored her own. She sat across from him, studying his face for a moment, unsure of what to expect. Would he finally admit that he was afraid of her? Of what they could become? He took a deep breath and met her gaze. "Sophia, I've been thinking about everything. About us. His voice was quieter than usual, more unsure. I've been pushing this away, thinking I could somehow keep control of the situation. But I can't do that anymore. I've realized that, despite everything, I want this with you. I don't want to let fear take over. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She had always known that Ethan struggled with his emotions, but hearing him admit it so openly caught her off guard. She had expected him to be distant, to back away just like he always did when things got too real. But here he was, vulnerable in a way that she hadn't seen before. "I'm scared too," she confessed, her voice soft but steady. "Scared of losing you, of this not working out. But I can't keep living in fear. I've spent so long building walls around myself, thinking that it was easier to protect myself than to take the risk of loving someone. But I don't want to do that anymore. I want to try. I want to try with you, even if it means failing." There was a long pause as Ethan absorbed her words. He stared at her for a moment, his gaze intense, before a slow smile began to spread across his face. It wasn't the smug, guarded smile she was used to. It wasn't the smug, guarded smile she was used to. "I don't know what the future holds for us, but I'm willing to find out," he said finally, his voice full of sincerity. "I want to be with you, Sophia. I want to build something with you. I want to build something with you. I don't know how to do it perfectly, but I'll try." Sophia's chest tightened with emotion as she reached across the table to take his hand. The touch felt like a promise, a commitment to face whatever came next. "We'll do it together," she said, her voice firm with newfound resolve. "We don't have to have all the answers right now, but we can figure it out one step at a time." Ethan squeezed her hand gently, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. It was a quiet moment, but it spoke volumes. This was the beginning of something new, something that neither of them could fully understand yet, but something they were willing to fight for. As they sat there, the weight of their fears lifting just a little more, Sophia realized that this was the moment that mattered. Not the promises they made, not the doubts that had plagued them for so long, but this moment right here, where they were willing to take a chance on each other. And for the first time, Sophia felt a sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to walk it. Together. Sophia arrived at the office early the next morning, the weight of the previous night's conversation still fresh in her mind. Ethan's words had lingered with her all through the night. "I'm willing to try." That simple statement had been a lifeline, pulling her out of the sea of doubt that had threatened to drown her. They were both ready to face whatever came next, together. But as she sat at her desk, a new anxiety began to settle in her chest. What now? They had acknowledged their fears, their vulnerabilities, but they still hadn't faced the full truth of their situation, their pasts, their insecurities. How could they move forward without letting all of that pull them back into old patterns? As she worked through the morning, her mind kept wandering back to Ethan. He had been different lately, softer, more open. But there was still a part of him that held back, a part that didn't trust the process. Sophia knew this was going to take time, but every time they shared a moment, every time their hands brushed or their eyes met, that spark of connection seemed to grow stronger. She couldn't help but feel that they were on the brink of something beautiful, but it was so easy for the fear to creep back in, threatening to unravel everything they had just begun to build. The door to her office opened, and Sophia looked up to see Ethan standing in the doorway. His presence filled the room, and for a moment the air felt thick with unspoken words. He was holding a folder, his usual confident demeanor in place, but his eyes. There was something different there today, something that made Sophia's heart skip a beat. "Sophia," Ethan said, his voice steady, but with a hint of hesitation. "We need to talk." Sophia's stomach fluttered, but she nodded, gesturing for him to sit across from her. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice calm despite the nervous energy buzzing beneath the surface. Ethan placed the folder on the desk, but didn't immediately open it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze focused on her. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said last night," he began. "About trying, about being willing to take a risk. And I realized something. I've spent so much time protecting myself, building these walls, and I've been afraid of getting hurt again. But the truth is, I don't want to keep living like that. I don't want to keep living like that. I don't want to push you away just because of my own fears." Sophia felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to him. It wasn't just the words. It was the raw honesty in his voice that made her realize how much he was struggling, how much he was willing to let go of in order to be with her. He wasn't perfect. He was human, just like her, and that made her heart ache in the best way possible. "That's what I'm afraid of too," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That we'll fall back into the same patterns, that we'll let our fears control us instead of choosing to be together. But I'm not willing to let that happen. I'm not willing to let that happen. I believe that, no matter what, we can make it work." For a moment, Ethan didn't say anything. He simply stared at her, his gaze intense, as if he were searching for something in her eyes. It was a silence that felt full of possibility, a moment where neither of them was rushing to fill the space with words. Slowly, Ethan reached across the desk and took her hand in his. The touch was warm, and for the first time in days it felt like they were both on the same page, both willing to let go of the past and step into the future together. "I'm scared, Sophia," he admitted, his voice soft but full of sincerity. "But I think, for the first time, I'm ready to be scared with you. I'm ready to be scared with you. I'm ready to let you in, to trust that this—" Sophia's breath caught in her throat, and she squeezed his hand gently. "We don't have to have it all figured out. We'll take it one step at a time. Together. That's all I need, Ethan." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Together," he repeated, as if testing the word out, letting it settle into his heart. And just like that, the tension that had held them both captive for so long seemed to melt away. There was no more uncertainty, no more fear of what might happen. They were in this together. No matter how hard it would get, no matter what the future held, they had each other. And for the first time, Sophia felt a peace she hadn't known in months. They weren't perfect, but they were real, and that was enough. Ethan stood up, and for the first time, he didn't hesitate. He walked around the desk and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a tight embrace. Sophia felt the weight of his heart against hers, the warmth of his body reassuring her that this was no longer just a moment. It was the beginning of something new, something that, for the first time, felt like it had a future. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Sophia knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together, because together was the only way it would work. Sophia stood in front of her apartment window, staring out at the city below, her mind still racing after the conversation with Ethan that morning. They had made progress, real progress, but as much as she wanted to believe that everything would fall into place now, there was still an underlying fear that lingered in the back of her mind. Ethan had opened up in ways he hadn't before, but she couldn't help but wonder, would he stay true to his words? Was he really ready to let go of the walls he had built for so long, or would they slowly creep back in, just as they had in every relationship before? She shook her head, pushing those thoughts aside. She couldn't keep letting fear dictate her actions. She had made a choice to trust Ethan, to take a leap with him. If they were going to make this work, they both had to stop second, guessing themselves. They had already come so far. Sophia glanced down at her phone as it buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from Ethan. and she felt a rush of nervous excitement at the sight of his name. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she read his message. "I've been thinking a lot today. I know we said we'd take things slow, but I need you to know that I'm all in, Sophia. I'm ready to be vulnerable with you. I'm ready to be vulnerable with you. I trust you, and I'm ready to see where this goes. Let's not waste time." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She had always known that Ethan was a man of few words, but these words, they were everything. They were everything. They were the affirmation she needed, the reassurance that they weren't just stumbling through this relationship by accident. He was committed. He was ready. And for the first time, she realized that she had to be too. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at her door. It was almost as if the universe was nudging her toward the next step. She walked to the door and opened it, her breath catching in her throat when she saw Ethan standing there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze filled with determination. He had come here in person after sending that message. He was ready to act, not just talk. "Sophia," he said softly, his voice more vulnerable than she had ever heard it, "I need you to know that I meant what I said. I'm all in. No more running. No more running. No more running. I'm here, and I want to see where this goes with you." For a moment, Sophia didn't say anything. She just stood there, taking him in. The man who had kept her at arm's length for so long, the man who now stood before her, raw and honest. It was the kind of vulnerability she had always wanted from him, and now that it was finally here, it felt overwhelming, almost too much to bear. But it was the best kind of overwhelming. It was real. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want this too, Ethan. I want this too, Ethan. I want to see where this goes, no matter how scary it feels. I trust you. I trust us." Ethan stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His eyes softened, and for a moment, the world seemed to disappear around them. The noise, the uncertainty, everything else faded away as he reached out to take her hand in his. The touch reassuring, grounding. "Then let's take the next step," he said, his voice steady now. Sophia nodded, feeling her heart swell in her chest. She didn't need to have everything figured out. They didn't need a perfect plan. All they needed was each other, and the willingness to try. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. They would face challenges. There would be moments of doubt, and they would stumble along the way. But she was no longer afraid. Not of the future, not of Ethan, and not of the uncertainty that had once threatened to keep her from truly living. She smiled up at him, her heart brimming with hope. "Together," she echoed. Ethan leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that felt like a promise. It was soft at first, tentative, as if they were both testing the waters. But then, as the kiss deepened, it was filled with the weight of everything they had been through to get to this point. Every fear, every moment of hesitation, every doubt. And in that kiss, all of it melted away. They were here, finally, in this moment, with no more barriers between them. When they pulled apart, Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. But she didn't need to. She could feel it. He was here. He was all in, and that was all that mattered. "So," Sophia said with a grin, "what do we do now?" Ethan chuckled, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "We start building," he said softly. "We start building our future, one step at a time." And with that, they walked forward, hand in hand, into a future that was uncertain but full of promise. Together. Sophia woke up the next morning with a sense of calm she hadn't felt in weeks. The chaos of the past few days, the whirlwind of emotions that had been spinning out of control, seemed to have quieted. She had faced her fears, and Ethan had done the same. Together, they had taken the leap into a new chapter of their lives, one that was full of uncertainty, but also full of possibility. As the morning light streamed through the window, she realized that no matter what happened next, they had made a choice. They had chosen to be vulnerable, to trust each other, and that was more than enough. She smiled as she stretched, her body still adjusting to the changes of the last few weeks. Ethan had been patient with her, gentle in his approach, but the intensity between them was undeniable. They had both been so careful, so afraid of falling too hard, too fast. But now, with each passing day, the walls between them were coming down. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, the way he reached for her hand in the quiet moments, the way he whispered his fears and hopes into the early hours of the morning. She knew now that they were in this together. There was no going back. As she moved through her morning routine, her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Ethan, and as she glanced at the screen, her heart skipped a beat. The words were simple, but they carried weight. "I can't wait to see you tonight. I'm looking forward to being with you, Sophia. Let's talk more about what comes next." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it wasn't a grand declaration. But it was enough. It was a promise of more, a promise of shared moments, of laughter and tears, of everything that made life worth living. She smiled and quickly responded, her fingers tapping out the words with a sense of certainty. "I can't wait, either. I'm ready for whatever comes next." The day passed in a blur of work and quiet anticipation. She caught herself smiling more than usual, a warmth spreading through her whenever she thought about Ethan. She hadn't felt this way in a long time. This sense of excitement for the future, this feeling that everything might actually turn out okay. There was something about him, something about the way he made her feel seen, understood, and loved, that filled her with a quiet joy. She knew that their journey wouldn't be without challenges, but she was no longer afraid, not with him by her side. By the time evening came, Sophia found herself in front of her mirror, adjusting the hem of her dress, making sure everything was just right. She didn't want to seem like she was overthinking it, but tonight felt different. They'd agreed to take things slow, to not rush into anything. But the tension between them was undeniable, and she couldn't help but wonder if tonight would change everything. Would it be another step forward, or would they retreat into their old patterns of fear and uncertainty? She didn't know, but for the first time in a long while, she was okay with that. They would figure it out. Together, when she arrived at the restaurant, Ethan was already there, waiting for her. His eyes lit up when he saw her, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. He stood to greet her, his smile genuine and full of affection. As he took her hand, she could feel the connection between them, strong, steady, and unwavering. They sat down at their table, the candlelight casting a soft glow on their faces. The conversation flowed easily, just like it always did, but there was something different tonight. There was an openness between them that hadn't been there before, a sense of comfort in each other's presence. They didn't need to talk about their fears anymore. They didn't need to question what was happening. They knew. They knew that this was real, that they were building something that could last. As the evening wore on, Sophia found herself leaning into him, feeling the warmth of his body next to hers, the steady beat of his heart against her own. And for the first time, she realized that this was what she had always wanted. Not perfection, not the absence of conflict or fear, but the willingness to face it all together. They had both been so scared of what the future held, but now it seemed like the future was theirs to shape. They didn't need to have all the answers, but they were both committed to finding them together. When the night came to an end, Ethan walked her to her car, and as they stood by the door, he turned to her, his hand gently cupping her face. "I know we don't have everything figured out yet," he said softly, but I believe in us. I believe in this. I believe in this." Sophia smiled, her heart full. "Me too," she whispered. And with that, they shared a kiss that felt like the beginning of something new, something beautiful. There were still questions ahead, still challenges to face, but Sophia knew, with every fiber of her being, that as long as they had each other, they could face it all. Together. Together. The story of Sophia and Ethan teaches us a valuable lesson about vulnerability, trust, and the courage it takes to truly connect with another person. In their journey, both characters were initially trapped in their fears. Fear of getting hurt, fear of being vulnerable, and fear of being vulnerable, and fear of failure. But it was only when they allowed themselves to embrace those fears and chose to take risks together that they were able to build something real. The message here is simple. Love and connection don't happen in perfection, and they certainly don't happen in perfection, and they certainly don't happen without vulnerability. It's about showing up, despite the fear, and trusting that the person you are with will walk alongside you every step of the way. Relationships take work, but they also require patience and understanding. And when both people are willing to meet each other halfway, they can create something stronger than they ever imagined. In life, we often find ourselves holding back out of fear, whether in relationships, work, or our personal growth. But the story reminds us that it's only by taking chances and facing the unknown that we find what we're truly capable of. So, what's your next leap? What will you do today to move beyond your fears and trust the process? Where did you come across this story? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories, inspiration, and lessons to help you grow.